I'm Kenigbolo Meya Stephen. I'm a front-end engineering lead at Bcaster and also a front-end architect with HouseSpace. And I also work as an independent consultant in general for front-end engineering, software engineering, and documentation as well. But today I'm here because I love documentation, docs for short, and I'm going to be talking about it. You can find me on Twitter at ExpensiveStevie. Do not ask me about that handle. I try not to answer that question. But yeah, what we'll be looking at today, we're going to be talking about what is documentation, what is legacy code, documentation and legacy code in React, how to navigate the murky waters, and then tips on how to make your React docs better. And lastly, we will have a brief summary. But for now, let's dive in. So what is documentation? I have a short code here which says it's a pathway to your source code. However, we're going to be looking at it in a more distinctive way. So according to Wikipedia, which is not the greatest of sources, but a source I consider to be more general in this case, it says software documentation is written text or illustration that accompanies computer software or is embedded in the source code. Now, documentation either explains how the software operates or how to use it. And this may mean a lot of different things to different people. And what documentation means to an end user might be different from what it means to a software engineer or to a product manager, for example. But in React, our docs that we usually use are mostly either system documentation, and system documentation focuses on documents that describe the system and its relevant parts. This can include requirement documents, design decisions, architectural decisions, descriptions of the source code, and a lot of other things as well. Your FAQs can also be considered to be system documentation. And then we have the user documentation. This generally focuses on manuals prepared for end users of a specific product, or as well, it can be for system administrators. This could include tutorials, for example, which include code snippets in your docs. They could be user guides, they could be troubleshooting manuals, for example, installation or reference manuals, as the case may be. Now, let's look at legacy code. This is a very interesting concept in software engineering, a concept that we find quite difficult as well. The greatest software engineering fallacy is that legacy code is bad code. And yes, I said it. A lot of the times we tend to categorize legacy code as bad code, which is not always the case. Now, I'm not saying that every legacy code is good. No, by no means. However, in a lot of cases, the legacy code are not necessarily bad code, as we might want to categorize them or classify them, as the case may be. Now, there's no universal definition for legacy code. However, in the context of this talk, I'll see it and we'll be looking at it as code that is no longer actively supported or code using libraries that are no longer actively maintained. Now, I have a few questions to ask. Is your code easy to change? Can you get nearly instantaneous feedback when you change it? Do you understand it? If the answer to any of these questions is no, we could easily classify your code as legacy code as well. And for what it's worth, it's probably draining time, money away, and efforts from your development team. However, when we look at legacy code in the scope of teams, it's mostly features that are either no longer supported or have been superseded, typically combined with little or no possibility to ever replacing them. And by them, I mean the code. A lot of the times you just use legacy code until the system dies. We can also say legacy code is code that has been inherited from someone or somewhere else, or possibly from an older version of a library. How do you categorize code as legacy? Actively supported. Is the code still actively supported in terms of development, or is it being used in maintenance mode at the moment? Is this how you categorize your legacy code? Is it based on the libraries maintained? Is the library or group of libraries used in the project or source code being actively maintained? Does this define legacy code for you? And the interesting one, code you're not comfortable changing. Do you categorize code as legacy because it's inherited and you're not comfortable changing it? A picture is worth 1,000 words. Almost every code base you would work on would probably be inherited. And we could easily term that as legacy if we go according to some definitions. However, it's important to remember and realize that the code you write today is possibly going to become legacy code tomorrow. And with that, I would like to get into documentation and legacy code in React. This is more of a beta suite paradigm, and I'm going to be trying to look at both the beta part and the suite part. But of course, I prefer to have the good news first. So let's look at the good part of all of this. Now, is there legacy code in React? If you have ever worked on any React code base written between the 0.13.x version and the 15.x versions, then in my opinion, you have dealt with a legacy React code base. You don't necessarily have to agree with me, but if you have dealt with one of these versions, you have either dealt with code that has actually been deprecated or some form of breaking changes. Definitely a handful of breaking changes and a ton of new and exciting features that have been shared with us. And for what is what, I think it's important to say that React as a library is always going to be evergreen and ever new to me personally. So when people say is there legacy code in React, I kind of understand why this question will come because, of course, for someone who loves React, this is always going to be evergreen, and that's totally understandable. Now, for a bit of perspective, let's look at these numbers. 325,277,771. These are the total number of downloads between 2019, 05/20, the 20th of May, 2019, and 2020, 05/20, the 20th of May, 2020. Now, the source of this is from the NPM library. And whilst I can agree with you that NPM downloads of a library do not necessarily give perspective on usage, I'm quoting these figures here because by the time we have 17.x version of React, a handful of people who have downloaded the React library within this time frame and still have this source code in production are possibly going to be dealing with legacy code. And that's a huge number. And even if we take out the first figure there and say, okay, maybe it's 25 million downloads, that's still a number of legacy code bases that might just still be available. And this is why dealing with legacy code in React and having appropriate documentation is super important. Now, we're talking about the love-hate paradigm. So I'm going to start with the love paradigm. One of the beauties of dealing with legacy code is that there are a lot of great online resources. As you know, the React community is huge. So we also have a structured changelog in the official React repository, which enables you to see breaking changes and deprecations as well. Of course, we've got Stack Overflow to the rescue. I believe if you go on Stack Overflow and find all the topics listed with React, you will see a lot of questions that are necessarily not from the version you are actually using at the moment. And last but not the least, my personal favorite, Twitter. Now, you might not want to acknowledge this, and that's totally okay if you do not use Twitter, but we do share a lot of knowledge on Twitter. And sometimes when you're stuck with legacy code, it might just be easier sharing it on Twitter and listening to how people have actually dealt with it as well. Twitter is also one of the beauties of all of this. Now, let's look at the hate paradigm. Now, I know hate is a strong word, but we can as well call this the dislike paradigm. Deprecations. Now, yes, we know that a lot of people do not like deprecations because it usually means they need to stop using something. However, the process is that it's such that there are always specific kind of warnings with regards to this. So it's easier to actually be able to handle this. However, I do accept and agree and understand that this can be a pain in the ass for some people. Breaking changes. Now, as much as we might not like to have breaking changes, if we follow what semantic versioning is all about, there is a possibility that every major version might have a breaking change. So this is quite possible. And although you might not like it, there are always ways to mitigate the spot. So I know it can be annoying, but this can also be mitigated in a couple of ways. However, the absence of docs. Now, this is the one singular reason that can make working with legacy React code a total nightmare for you. And as if that's not enough, absence of proper project docs. So yes, you can have docs, but do the docs reflect the project that you're actually documenting? Because there's you writing documentation and there's you writing documentation that reflects your project. And last but not the least, absence of proper project docs. So yes, you have project documentation. Are they properly outlined? Do they communicate to the end user who's going to be using this documentation what your ideas are? This can also be a simple reason to hate working with legacy React code. So the absence of docs is what we're going to be focusing on today. And what we're going to try to do is to find ways to actually mitigate those challenges. One of the greatest challenges when it comes to working with legacy React code is the absence of documentation in projects. How does the code fit into the current and the past business case? What were the underlying reasons regarding the implementation? Now, when I refer to proper project docs, these are two important questions that you need to ask yourself. And like I mentioned, the code you write today is going to be legacy tomorrow. So how does the code fit into the current business case or use cases that you have? How does the code fit in the past business case or current business case that you have? What are the underlying reasons behind certain implementations you have? Why is this done this way? Can I take a look at it and say, okay, I totally understand that. Now I get that understanding in this case can be totally subjective and not something you can measure because it differs from person to person. But a simple baseline that says, I get the general idea based on how this is explained is actually very important. Now, if you start working with legacy React projects, you are lucky in situations where you have people to talk to and you have people to ask questions about this project. That's on the good side. The people who designed it, the people who wrote it are available. Now, imagine that they were not working on that code base anymore. They were no longer in the company, or something happened and they passed away. That entire knowledge base is gone because there is an absence of proper project documentation for this code base you're working on. And in reality, this wastes everyone's time. Knowledge transfer for newcomers would be more painful than it is. And we are trying to create an industry where people are welcome. The last thing we want is to create barriers, artificial barriers, with our lack of documentation. We all know that documentation is not given the attention it deserves, and this is no different, especially in legacy React projects. Now, let's find a way to navigate the murky waters. It's not all doom and gloom. There are always some ways to navigate legacy code in the absence of documentation. Now, I'm not trying to say it's going to be easy. I'm just saying there are certain steps you could take to ease the process for you. There just might be a way out. And I would like us to take a look at some suggestions on dealing with that. So, first of all, I want you to know that you've got this. When you get to that legacy project you need to work on, it's not going to be all doom and gloom. You've got this, and you can do it. First things first, let's look at the React version. This should ideally be visible in the README. You should state out the React version that the project is built with in the README. However, if it's not there, then you should dig a bit deeper into your package.json file, as well as your package lock.json and or yarn-lock, as the case may be, depending on what, if you use npm or you use yarn. Now, this is important because you get to know the exact version of React this project is built on. It sets the baseline for the rest things that are going to follow. The next thing you should do is check out for the deprecations. Now, a very important factor to consider when working with legacy React code is the deprecations across versions. Once you know the version in use, which is what the first step, getting the React version, do well to add it to the README file, clearly stating it if it's not there. And then go to the official React repository, find that version, and check out every deprecation or breaking change as the case may be. Note this down because this would help you in dealing with this code, and when you decide to do an update, it helps you in knowing exactly the paths to follow. Next thing, mixins. I know there has been a lot of talk about this. I've never been a fan, and for good reason. So scan the code to find if mixins are being used. Consider replacing these for higher ordered components. Now, an important caveat to put here is that higher ordered components are not a bulletproof replacement for mixins. However, I can say they're an amazing solution when integrating the seams of your legacy application with your new React world. They can help you solve a lot of problems. So this is something I suggest you also do. A lot of legacy React code do have mixins. This was a pattern that was used back then, still used in a couple of places, but we all know that this is probably not the best idea. Now, let's talk about state management also in this legacy code base without documentation. State management is also a very important and integral part of React projects. So this is something that you should put your eyes out for as well. States that are only used and modified within individual components should be localized to the needed components. Now, something I've noticed in a lot of legacy React code bases is that we take a lot of things and put them into the Redux store, for example. However, in a lot of cases, they do not need to be in any store. If the state is managed by the component and is changed or going to be handled by that given component, then it does not necessarily need to be in a global state or in a store. Look out for those, clear this pollution, and you might be doing yourself and your entire team a good favor, as well as getting hands-on in clearing a good path for migration to a much updated version. Now, class components. This is also a very interesting concept. Avoid the desire to instantly rewrite these into functional components as your first step. There's always the tendency to want to do this, but I would advise that when dealing with legacy React code, you go through the first 4 I've highlighted, which is finding the version, checking out for the deprecations and breaking changes, finding the mixins and changing those to higher order components, finding state, going through the state management and trying to localize states that are only modified, updated in specific components before coming to trying to rewrite your class components into functional components. Now, I understand and I totally agree. I'm pro functional components because they're much easier to read and definitely easier to test. And at the end of the day, they're just plain JavaScript functions anyways. They also give you the possibility to end up with less code. And in a lot of cases, they help you use best practices as well. So you definitely should do that, but that should not be the first thing you start doing when you take up a legacy React code base. Avoid the temptation to do that first. And the last tip would be the lifecycle hooks, which I consider very important. While these are useful, avoid the temptation of skipping this because some hooks are slated to be deprecated. Some hooks might be deprecated in 17.x as well. And then, of course, simple examples are cases where when you have component will mount, whilst dealing with your legacy code and moving your upgrade, this should be changed to component did mount, for example, or component will update to component did update. You know, a couple of when it comes to lifecycle hooks, they're quite tricky. So do not feel comfortable that, this is how they are and this is fine. The deprecation warnings are there. And if you look at the deprecation warnings, you would actually see and take note of all of this. So this is also super handy for dealing with legacy code. Now, I know that, like I mentioned earlier, it might seem daunting to actually deal with it, but legacy code is not necessarily bad code, and there are ways which you can handle this. And I've just listed a few tips that I consider very important when you have to deal with legacy code that does not have documentation at all. Again, this can apply to code that does have documentation, but it will be lesser in terms of what you need to look for. Now, it's not all rosy, for sure. I'm not going to lie to you. Dealing with legacy React code, especially when there's no documentation, can be daunting and most times just downright frustrating. However, these challenges can be mitigated and handled. There is a lot of legacy React code out there. Almost every code base you would work on will be probably mostly legacy. You can try to avoid it and feel bad when you're stuck with it, or you could see this as an opportunity to develop some valuable skills that helps your career as an engineer as well. And now let's focus on some tips on making your docs better. Now, I'm not going to be focusing on general best documentation practices. I'm going to be focusing on the little things you can do to make sure you do not end up in the same problem that you have when you're working with legacy React code. Now, I will try to center on how to encourage your team to write documentation, quite similar to the ways you would encourage people to write clean code, to do regular refactoring, to use design patterns, or to add enough unit tests. You can always use these tips to make people improve your docs or add documentation as well. You can do this. Trust me, you can. So good docs are equivalent to endorphins. Now, I would have changed this to be a little bit more JavaScripty and have the double equals to or the triple equals to, but I intentionally left this way because good docs are actually endorphins. And for what is what, endorphins are the chemicals released when you're happy, when you smile. For me, good docs are endorphins, and I believe for a lot of end users as well and engineers who are going to take the project, good docs are endorphins. Now, one of the ways to improve your docs for legacy project is by example, leading by example. Now, lead by example, if you write good documentation, your colleagues might just start picking up on it too. Your peers might start doing it. Everyone around you might pick up the habit. And I know because I've seen it work around me. So if you're an engineering lead or just a regular member of the engineering team, regardless of what end of the spectrum you are, just do it by example. And there's a possibility that others might follow. For engineering leads, you are in the best position to actually do this and have those who look up to you follow on as well. Systematic reviews. Having systematic code reviews targeted at inspecting your documentation will drastically improve the quality of your docs. In a lot of my talks on documentation, I have always stated that reviewing your docs as rigorously as you review your code is super important and gives you the possibility to have really good documentation. Measure. Now, this is subjective, but do you have some base measure for your documentation? Is it easy to set up? Subjective, because easy for one person might not be the same for the other person. Is it easy to understand? Easy is totally subjective. Is it easy to understand for one person or not easy to understand for the other person? The concept of measuring should be something you think about carefully before having in your docs. And if there is a measure you believe, you should have working examples of how to deal with measure. For example, if you say this is easy to set up in 5 minutes, show how it's easy to set up in 5 minutes. Give evidence of how that can be done in 5 minutes. You might be surprised at the end, but I challenge you to do that. Discuss openly. Now, this is something a lot of people take for granted, but I have discovered is super important in documentation as well. An important way to enforce the idea of documentation is to have open discussions about both the positives and the negatives of it. So this is also super important. Versions and patterns. I'm putting this here because it's also very important. Clearly document in the README section of your project what version you're using. And somewhere in your project, it's important to show or explain why a certain pattern is being used or what patterns you're using. If you're more functional, you should write it. If you prefer to use object-oriented paradigm, you should somehow explain this to the end users, the consumers of these docs. Clear and concise naming. Now, this is the singular most complicated thing I have discovered in software engineering as a discipline. Naming is a very difficult aspect of programming. However, it plays a huge role in communication. And communication is an essential part of documentation. So please name your code, variables, and functions as clearly as possible. And that's it. I'm going to leave you with this. The code you write today is going to be legacy code tomorrow. Kiitos. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, I'll be available. You can find me on Twitter at ExpensiveStevie and on GitHub at Kenigbolo. Thank you very much.
And we're back at the studio. Thank you, Kenigbolo, for that talk. Reminder to all of our viewers, the questions go on the RF 2020 Miniconf documentation Q&A channel. Feel free to ask them in general as well, if you have too many Slack channels as it is. Now, Kenigbolo, I loved what you said at the very end of it. Like, remember that the code that we write today is, legacy code tomorrow. And I personally, I found this, I've learned from this because, there's a saying that, you should write code like, the maintainer is a homicidal maniac that knows where you live. It's a little known fact that that's why I live in UK now. I wrote some really bad code and I left the job and, I no longer felt safe on the streets of Helsinki. So if you don't want to leave the country, then, write good docs. Anyway, thank you for that talk. Let's go to the first question. What's the very, very first thing that you do when you drop into a legacy code base? Somebody adds you to a GitHub org and you are completely clueless. What's the first thing that you do?
So the first step is always information gathering. You try to get as much information of the project you've been added to as possible. And how do you do that? One perfect way of communication is the documentation. So you go into the documentation to try to gather as much information about this project as possible. And then, of course, there are possibilities to try to look at previous issues, depending on what version control they're using. But the first point of call is always the doc, because that should be giving you a quick intro to the project and a much larger overview as you go on.
Yeah, absolutely. But what if there isn't documentation? This is the whole talk. But it's do you think it adds value to use any kind of automatic document generators? There are all kinds of tools. Ecology comes to mind. That essentially just takes your React code base, uses data like JS docs and prop types to generate a set of documentation. Have you found that helpful in practice?
Well, in practice, it does seem helpful, but there are a lot of things that this kind of automation, a lot of problems this automation creates that becomes problematic. And one of it is things like language. So there's generators do not actually check for those things. So whilst they're quite good and it's okay to use them, I don't advise this to be your primary source of documentation or your primary source of generating documentation, because you would have things like inappropriate languages, or also situations where you might have personally thought that what you have described is descriptive enough, but end up finding a situation when someone else thinks that it just doesn't make any sense to them. So there are pros and cons. Of course, there are pros for using it, but if you decide to use that, it's very important to be aware that there can be downsides. So I do not actively encourage people to use those tools without other tools as well. So not as standalone as your center for documentation generation.
Yeah, I would agree generally. I think I've had mixed success with it. I think there's in my experience, it's easier to just browse a code base when you generate the docs, but you should delete them immediately after, because otherwise you start to rely on them. You imagine that all these words on a page are actually going to help people, and you don't write any real docs. Is that what you meant?
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah, 100%. Okay, so I have another question which I definitely have never thought of before, which is this idea of documentation as endorphins, which I guess more broadly you could say that documentation, whether it's good or bad, it affects people's feelings a lot. And you said this thing a few times, which is that you got this, and I just wanted to, there's no question here, I just wanted to say I would love to have you on my team, and then when I'm pulling my hair out, just swipe in the room and go, you got this. Is that like a practice that you bring into your work generally? Are you the positive guy in the room?
Well, I think it's important, and yes, I am that person. But there are also reasons, and one of the major reasons why I always encourage people and I'm positive about it is because I've been on the end of writing bad documentation. So I've been the guy who gave a legacy code base to somebody to maintain, and it was totally horrible. And I've also been the guy who has inherited something even more horrible than what I gave over. So I've been on both ends of the spectrum. I've seen how difficult it is, and I've just realized that one of the best ways to go about it is just to encourage people, to make people understand that if I could do it, you could also do it. We all could do it. And in the end, everyone wins.
Yeah, it's an interesting psychological phenomenon. This idea, it's not only in technology, only in code, but like, for example, if you had like a really strict parent or you had a terrible experience in school, then you tend to like naturally, like psychologically want to perpetuate those same experiences to your own, children in some ways. Like, why is it so hard for us sometimes to think, the idea, the golden rule of do unto others as you would like to have done to you? Like, where is that disconnect? And do you think documentation is one of those things that like should be definitely covered by the golden rules?
Yeah, I would say that as well. I think it has a huge role to play, which is also why in the talk I did say that as engineering leads or as just members of the team, it's super important to try to inculcate the practice to others, because someone who starts to believe and understand and value the importance of documentation is going to have that as a fundamental part of the engineering lifestyle for the foreseeable future. So it's something that once you start doing, you never want to live without. And that also means that when you go onto a new team, you are still going to be passing the same knowledge that you have and sharing the same tips on documentation. So it's a continuous process. And just like you said, yes, it's psychologically, you have this hope in your head that documentation is good. And when you go to a new team, it's the first thing you try to encourage others to do if they don't do it. It's a transfer of skill set that you have actually learned.
Yeah, like this is an experience that I've had a few times in my career when I review somebody's pull request and I reject it because of bad documentation. What I find out is that nobody's ever taught them that how to write good documentation. Like this tribal knowledge of, I learned this thing, therefore I should pass it on doesn't really seem to happen. And it's kind of ironic that in some ways, the best way of like passing these ideas on is with documentation. But if nobody writes it and nobody reads it, then, like the information doesn't like get passed on, I suppose.
Yes, and that's true because documentation is also knowledge sharing, something that a lot of people, a lot of developers, engineers actually seem to forget. It's not just a communication tool, it's also a way to pass knowledge as well. And shared knowledge actually trickles down and it brings longevity to several projects. So proper projects that are properly documented are more likely, but at least 10 times more likely to survive in the long run than projects that are not.
Yeah, I'm not sure if you like mentioned this particular phrasing, but the idea was very clear in your talk, which is something that I've heard oftentimes, that the definition of legacy code isn't, like you said, it's not bad code, or definition of legacy code isn't just that it's old code, but definition of legacy code is code that doesn't have tests and documentation. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No. I was just agreeing with you.
Okay, cool. Yeah, it's almost as if like it's not a correlation that legacy code happens to have poor documentation, but it's causation. If you document the code, then it doesn't it almost isn't legacy, because no matter if it's you're the person who wrote it, but if it's like correctly sort of like if there's a pathway into understanding it, then that code actually can live so much longer. Like, I'm sorry, I'm just rambling here, but like this idea is just blooming in my head where when we use the word legacy in code, it's exactly the same as people use when they have their legacy in their life. After they're gone, what do you want your legacy to be? And isn't that kind of the same as like, the code that you leave behind is your life's work, and it's like how people will remember you.
Exactly. I think I mentioned it during the talk about legacy code not necessarily being bad code or old code. I think it's been a misconception. And we have somehow bastardized the use of the word legacy. Legacy isn't always bad. It doesn't always have to be bad. And code would not necessarily be legacy if certain aspects are actually paid attention to. If you take a code base today that was built 10 years ago, but you can actually work with it. There are tests, you can see the code running, you can understand the code. Would you actually tag that code as legacy code in terms of being bad? No, you would still see it as working code that you can also improve on. However, when things like documentation, tests, and a lot of other things are actually missing, or code that is not even understandable, by default, you will term it legacy code because it makes no sense to you. And this is it. It's a common misconception that we've had. So I know a lot of the times we use the word legacy with relation to bad code, but that's fallacy. In software engineering, legacy code is not necessarily bad code. It might just be code that you don't even understand. Yeah.
Maybe we should rebrand legacy code. Like maybe we should call it like rescue. Like when you have a kitten that doesn't have a home, it's not a legacy kitten. It's just a rescue. You know, like it's something that you can breathe. You know, give a new life to. Like maybe that is like the ultimate virtue of software developer is to give an old code a new life in maybe in a new cloud environment or something.
Absolutely.
Yeah, this is the problem. I think a lot of the things in our industry where people quite naturally only want to work things on that are new and sexy because you know that it increases your market value, it increases your sort of like keyword matches with recruiters. But at the same time, like there's still money to be made in maintaining COBOL code from 50 years ago. So do you think there would be like a market for somebody to specialize in just like turning old React 0.x apps into modern React apps?
Well, I'm an example because most of my consulting is centered around migrating legacy code to something a bit more usable or something a bit more understandable. So I think there's a huge market there. I think it's a huge business. I'm going to take a short work now. So it's getting cold. And if you know Finland, it can be quite chilly. So I'm going to take a short work and come inside.